Pesachim Daf Samach Aleph. Today's anonymous email has two beautiful pshatim. We'll go through one. We discuss and share how important a good thought is in Yiddishkeit. You can make it or break it with your thought. And he brings a Rashi by Noach. We know Shem and Yafes both covered their father. Shem was zoicha for a talus, to cover one's body with a talus, and Yafes was zoicha to cover one's body after Kfura with Kfura. And Rashi says, because Shem was Nis'ametz Yoser, he put in more effort, but they both did the same thing, they both covered. So he explains, because Shem had more kavana. His kavana was l'shem mitzvah, whereas Yafes wasn't l'shem mitzvah. Beautiful. We're discussing yesterday that a carbon Pesach during the year, let's say Hanukkah time, carbon Pesach, if a person brings that carbon Pesach during Hanukkah, puzzle. But if he changes it, Shaloi Lishma, he says it's not a carbon Pesach, it's a Shlamim, then it's kosher. The Gemara wonders, what if you take another psul? Switching the owner's designation passes the carbon. So what if you switch it during Hanukkah on this carbon Pesach? Does that help the carbon Pesach? Just like Shaloi Lishma. Rav Papa says it does. You know why? Because Shinui Bailam and Loi Lishma, changing the owner's designation and the type of carbon it is, are identical. You see that they're identical on every Pesach. Both of them passel a carbon Pesach. So if one of them is machshir a carbon Pesach during the year, in other words, Loi Lishma is machshir, so Shinui Bailam should also be machshir. Says Rava, that's not true. There's four major differences between Shinui Bailam and Loi Lishma. Loi Lishma, says Rava, is a machshava, is a thought about the animal. He's changing the animal in his thought. But Shinui Bailam, to change the owner's designation, to go from a Reuven to a Shimon, that's in another person. Very different. The Gemara says that's not different. It's the same thing. So now we're down, we don't have an afkamina yet. Second afkamina is, Loi Lishma applies on all four avodas. If a person has that thought that I'm going to make a shlamim instead of a Pesach, even if it's during Shechita, Kabbalah, Hilach, and Zrika, possible. La'achar misa, once the owner of a carbon dies, his yarshim must bring the carbon. And if the kohen has a bad machshava of Loi Lishma, that this carbon is not a carbon Pesach, it's a shlamim, the owner is not yaitza, and the yarshim would have to bring another carbon from the mace's property. And finally, Loi Lishma could ruin a carbon tzibur. Every morning you bring a carbon tamid, afternoon, a musaf and Shabbos. If the kohen thinks, no, it's not a musaf, this is a chatas, ruin. But you cannot ruin a carbon tzibur by saying that it's a different ownership, because all of Klal Yisrael are equal in that carbon. Gemara says 2 out of the 4 don't count, but at any rate, we're left with 2 of these svaras, the ones in green, and therefore there's no connection between Shinui Bailam and Loi Lishma. At any rate, Rava paskins that this carbon Pesach, which is brought during the year, and you switch the owner designation, it passes the carbon, it's not machshir. Says the Mishnah, we had this partially yesterday. If a person brings a carbon Pesach and he thinks to himself that the entire group is for sick people and old people who physically can't eat, carbon is possible. If the entire group are people that didn't register to the carbon, possible. If the entire group are tmeim, they are possible. If they are relim, they don't have bris milah, possible. But if you mix up the group, you say part of the group are people that could eat, part can eat, kosher. Part are tar, part are tummy, kosher. Part are registered, not registered. Part are arelim and not arelim, kosher. If you shech the carbon Pesach before chatzais, possible. The pasuk says ben arbaim has to be in chatzais. As we learned the other day, carbon Pesach always comes after carbon tamid. But if you shech the carbon Pesach before tamid, it's kosher. What you should try to do is mix the blood so that it doesn't congeal, and then do the zrikas hadam of the carbon Pesach after the zrikas hadam of the tamid. But if you don't do so, it's still kosher. What does it mean that people weren't registered? It means that you designated the entire animal for one group, and then you shechted it for another group, possible. It says in the pasuk, the michsas nefashos. Michsas, one pshat in Gemara is a lashon of menuyim, of being registered. And anytime in kachim, the Torah repeats the word or the halacha, it's ma'akev, you must do so. It's not just a mitzvah, it ruins the carbon, and over here it says michsas nefashos, it says tachaisu, it's the double lashon. Rebbe says that the word michsas is actually a lashon of shechtis for me, it's in Syrian. Now, if a person shechs for people who cannot eat, old people, sick people, then it's ma'akev. How do I know it's ma'akev? The carbon is possible because in the same pasuk that it talks about being registered, it talks about not being able to eat. What happens, a discussion in the Gemara, if a person shechs the carbon Pesach during Shechita, he's thinking to himself, this is for people that are nimal, they have a bris milah. And at the same time, during Shechita, he's thinking to himself, but I'm going to do this zrika later on. Now that I'm holding by Shechita, I'm going to do this zrika for people who don't have a bris milah. Rav Chisda holds that you could think during zrika about arelim and passel it, and Rabbi says you can't, and therefore it's kosher. Rabbi learns that the pasuk v'chol arel means only if everybody in the group is an arel, then it becomes possible, and if not everybody is an arel, it remains kosher. But the word zois, says Rabbi, and that's a machlokes because they both agree. Rabbi and Rav Chisda both agree to that idea that everybody has to be puzzle when it comes to shechita. But the word zois, says Rabbi, only applies to shechita. During shechita, everybody has to be puzzle in order to puzzle. But by zrika, even if everybody's an arel, it's not puzzle. And Rav Chisda says the opposite. But before we get there, Rabbi says that why is zrika any different than shechita? I'll tell you why. Because there's no machshavas oichlin by zrika, like we said before. He holds that you cannot passel machshavas oichlin by zrika. Rav Chisda, on the other hand, holds there is machshavas oichel by zrika, and therefore he has to explain that the char arel, like we said before, is if everybody's an arel at one time, then it passes. But the word zois says only by shechita you need everybody. But by zrika, even if a small amount of the people are puzzle, are arelim, it passes the carbon. Rav Ashi says no. V'chol arel means even some of them, a partial amount of the group will passel. And then the word v'zois comes to say that only all of them passel by shechita and by zrika. In other words, they're all equal. In order to passel this carbon, you need a machshava that the entire group, either by shechita or the entire group by zrika. According to Rav Ashi, if the arel that he's thinking about is a manui, he's registered to the group, then according to everybody, this carbon is possible. But if he's not a manui, he's not registered to the group, according to Rabbah, it's kosher. Why? Because this arel is not a bar kapara. He's not in the parasha. And Rav Chisda says no. The arel, even though he's not in the parasha, chayil, the famous concept of since he could perform a bris milah, then he would be in the parasha, he would be chayiv, and therefore he ruins it. So we had in the brisa that arel you could compare it to tuma and you can compare it to pigul. On the one hand, it's similar to tuma because just like tuma doesn't apply everywhere because a tummy could send a shliach to bring a carbon, and arel also only applies in carbon pesach, not to other carbonas, so they're similar. On the other hand, and pigul is not the same. On the other hand, arel is similar to pigul. Why? Because pigul is never allowed, and arel and carbon pesach is never allowed. Where tuma is allowed. Have a wonderful day.